Yeah, thank you very much. And I guess I can still say good morning to everybody. What I want to present on is joint work with my colleague Florian Freud, who is at the Thun Institute, which is a federal research institute on rural areas, forestry, and fisheries in Germany. The background of my talk, I probably don't need to delve much into. You heard a lot that dietary changes are very important to stay within key environmental limits and planetary boundaries. And at the same time, they also have tremendous health co-benefits in terms of reducing the mortality and incidence from diet-related diseases. In order to that, we need to change our diets drastically, and we heard a little bit about it. Dietary change alone, of course, only looks at the demand side. So what we always need to think together with dietary changes are changes in the production system. And what you see here are projections to 2050 and how business as usual projections would basically increase or decrease certain food groups and where we should be headed if we move towards healthy and sustainable dietary patterns that are in line with the Eat Lancet targets. And as you can see here, instead of growing ever more staples, sugar, and animal source foods, we really need drastic reductions in those in the global agricultural system and much more tremendous increases in fruits and vegetables, legumes, and nuts and seeds. That is not only true on a global level, but also in most regions. And that takes into account technological changes. So this idea that we just can still produce what we produce and just making more efficient just doesn't hold, neither globally nor regionally. What obviously is behind lots of agricultural production are agricultural subsidies. And although those have come down over time, they still represent about 20% of the production value in OECD countries, and they have been increasing in non-OECD countries and are now at roughly 10 to 15%. So in this study, we wanted to look at what could be the impacts of agricultural subsidy reform. Can we actually make agricultural subsidies work for this food transformation that we need for sustainability and health purposes? In order to look at that, we coupled a whole model, a whole economy model with agricultural detail, together with country and crop-specific environmental footprints, and the comparative risk assessment of diet and weight-related risk factors. The chain of impacts we looked at were really, if you change subsidies, what impact does that have on production? Changes in production has an impact on the environment, but changes in production also influence trade and influence prices, which then influence consumption. Consumption influences diet-related and weight-related risk factors, and both consumption and health specifically, if we think about impacts on the labor market, work on the economy. So we ran through lots of different scenarios, and let me just pick out some here. So when you talk about agricultural subsidies, there will always be libertarians who say those are market distortions, we shouldn't have any of that. So we looked at a complete removal as sort of one scenario. The other scenarios, we said, okay, maybe we keep the subsidies, but we use them for things that provide public goods, like lower environmental impacts or improved health. So we actually coupled agricultural subsidies to growing of nutrition-sensitive plant-based crops like fruits, vegetables, legumes, and nuts. And then in another set of scenario, we completely restructured and said, well, instead of keeping regional subsidies the same, maybe we should allow countries to subsidize based on their current GDP share or their population share. So this also changes the regional distribution of subsidies. This is what the subsidies according to the database we used. We didn't include tariffs as subsidies here because that throws a lot of things together. And you can see here that they are higher in OECD countries and than in non-OECD countries, and not all of them go to foods that we would consider as healthy and sustainable. If we change the subsidy structure, we see that production of lots of foods would go down if we removed all the subsidies. So this is the remove scenario. If we coupled them to 100%, we would have quite a big increase in the production of fruits and vegetables, and same in the other restructured scenarios. As a percentage, we could see increases in fruits and vegetables by up to 60% with a complete coupling in places that currently have high agricultural subsidies. That would reduce greenhouse gas emissions all across the board in those different scenarios, but depending on the specific scenario, it might increase resource demand on fresh water and land use. The consumption side, on the consumption side, we usually see that market reactions balance changes in production, but nonetheless, we see still large reductions in fruits and vegetables and other things in the removal scenario, and high increases in the coupled scenario. What that would mean in terms of health is that, interestingly, because of the large reductions in fruit and vegetable consumption, the removal of agricultural subsidies doesn't seem to be a good idea from a health perspective, and that shows a number of avoided deaths here. But a coupled scenario would actually improve health measured in that way and reduce diet-related mortality. The regional incidence of that differs depending how you couple those. If you couple them based on current expenditure on subsidies, or if you restructure how much each country can spend. Lastly, if we looking at the economic impacts, we saw that, why libertarians usually recommend no subsidies, that increases allocative efficiency, meaning you don't prescribe what workers or sectors invest in and work in. So you get workers being able to make more efficient use of their working time. But the interesting thing is that we can also get to a positive economic impact if we improve health and by that actually have a higher labor force. And that in some of the coupled scenarios, especially the restructured scenarios, actually outweighs the reduction in allocative efficiency that you would expect if you have a bigger coupling of agricultural subsidies. You can get that with restructuring, or you can get that with having a half of the subsidies coupled. But then you would sacrifice basically health impacts there. So the upshot of those figures is basically removing all agricultural subsidies could be economically and environmentally beneficial, but it could negatively impact population health. So if we talk about something that affects indeed those positive externalities that subsidies currently support to some degree, then we want to think hard about whether we want to remove it completely. Coupling, on the other hand, of subsidies to production of nutrition-sensitive crops could improve population health, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but could have negative economic impacts and might also have other impacts on other resource demands. Partial coupling could mitigate the economic losses, but also would reduce health and economic benefits. But a complete restructuring of subsidies so that countries can, for example, spend a certain amount of their GDP on subsidies, provided they couple them to the production of nutrition-sensitive crops, would preserve the large health impacts that we identified, but also avoid the economic losses and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, model analysis like these are subject to lots of caveats. I just leave them on there for you to read. But I guess the big conclusion here is that agricultural subsidy reform could indeed contribute to a food system transformation, especially for increasing fruit and vegetables. In the scenarios of 100% coupling, the reduction, the increases were such that there would be 50 grams per day more in OECD countries, as an example. So this is really a really big increase. But we also saw it was less efficient in terms of bringing the consumption of animal source foods down. So for that, other policy measures would be needed. And of course, agricultural subsidy reform is politically very heated, so I leave the discussion whether any of that is feasible up to the discussion. Thank you.